Hello, everyone. Welcome to Elasmocast. Today is going to be a really cool episode. We have Dr. David Shiffman, and he's going to be talking all about sharks and their importance and conservation and how to protect these magnificent animals. So, how are you doing, David?
Doing great, Ben. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and we've been trying to plan this episode for a little while, but it's great that we're finally able to do it. And before we start with your work, let's hear a bit about your background and your research interests and how did you really get into sharks?
Sure. So, I have a PhD in interdisciplinary ecosystem science and policy from the University of Miami, where I looked at both the role that sharks play in the coastal food webs in South Florida, but also interdisciplinary means the human side of this too. So, I also looked at what does that mean for threats to sharks? What do people know about it? What do people think about it? What are the policy solutions to it? And my master's degree was in sort of pure marine biology, pure food web ecology, and then I transitioned during my PhD to this interdisciplinary public perception and policy side. And these days, I live and work in the Washington D.C. area, where I run an ocean science and conservation research, policy, and communications consulting firm. And I also teach ocean conservation at Georgetown.
Yeah, and what made you really want to get into more of like the conservation and I guess the anthropogenic aspects of sharks?
Well, there were a few things. So during graduate school, I got to go to a lot of conferences. A lot of this was due to my social media presence, that conferences were actually paying me to come to help run social media for the meeting, and they didn't care that I was also presenting my research and networking. So I got to go to more than 30 conferences for free as a graduate student all over the world. And at all of these conferences, I was hearing the same story. The science is clear that these animals are threatened. We need to do more to protect them. Someone should really talk to the public. Someone should really help scientists understand the policy side of this. And I thought, I'm someone, I can do that. So I started taking classes, some of them as workshops at these conferences, and then also during my PhD itself, there was a lot of focus on this. But this was sold to me by the director of my PhD program as when we're trying to protect endangered species of wildlife, the rules and regulations that we pass don't actually tell the wildlife what to do. They tell the people what to do, how to reduce our impact. And that means there's probably value in understanding the people side. So I still do a lot of sort of traditional marine biology field research, typically these days in the context of teaching students how to do that stuff. So I teach these 3 and 6 day live aboard classes down in Florida where students live on a research vessel with me and practice catching, tagging, measuring, releasing sharks. But and there's also a lecture on that that's either in person here at Georgetown or online at a few other places. But my day-to-day work these days is more policy and communications focused, including research on that stuff. So we're surveying stakeholders, we're drafting management advice based on science. We're generally trying to help scientists, environmental advocates, and managers better understand each other because theoretically we're all on the same side. But there's so many problems with scientists who don't know how to talk to people who aren't scientists, and they end up issuing management advice that doesn't actually make any sense. And you get managers who are well intentioned but might not have a background in technical science and they miss something important. And you get advocates who want to help but are frustrated by these groups not talking to each other. So by being able to work sort of in the middle of this space of what we call in my world the science policy interface, I've been able to help these groups understand each other better and work together better and get a lot of good things to happen.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I started Elasmocast was because for a lot of people, scientific literature is just not something that they can really process because like as you know, there's a lot of jargon and things like
There's a
that.
there's a lot of 15 syllable words that you would never see outside of a scientific research journal for sure.
Exactly. And even if you're a researcher, but it's just a slightly different field, you might not understand it. So I created this podcast so that I could interview the researchers of the work that I love, but at the same time, do it in a more palatable way that people can understand more holistically. And
Yeah, that
another,
sounds awesome. How's it been going?
I
You
think
meeting your goals?
I hope so. People in the comments can can let us know for sure. But yeah, and you are also an author too of not just scientific work, as I can see in the background. You have Why
Yes.
Sharks Matter.
Yes, so I also am a freelance science journalist. I've written for National Geographic, Scientific American, The Washington Post. I now have two different monthly columns in Scuba Diving Magazine. But I wrote a book called Why Sharks Matter, which is also my social media handles. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, or Blue Sky at Why Sharks Matter if anyone has follow-up questions. And I wanted to write that book because in the context of all of my public science engagement, all of my outreach, I realized that the conversations that scientists are having about sharks and how to save them are very different from the conversations that well-intentioned members of the public are having about sharks. There's a lot of misunderstanding, there's a lot of lack of knowledge, and there are a ton of shark books that are out there. I have three shelves of them over my other shoulder here, but many of them are sort of fun facts about sharks, and then on the last page it says, sharks are in trouble, don't eat shark fin soup, or they're very, very, very technical textbooks for graduate level ecology, fisheries, or things like that. And there's nothing sort of that had all the relevant details directed towards a general public audience. And that's what I tried to do with Why Sharks Matter. And I, part of the reason we would have trouble scheduling this interview is because I'm still traveling all over the world talking about this. I get invited to give these public lectures about why sharks matter. Last week I was in San Francisco doing it. A few weeks ago I was in Sri Lanka and got to give a public talk there that made the national news there. So I've been absolutely thrilled with the reception that Why Sharks Matter has gotten. I have a new book coming out this November called Why Sustainable Seafood Matters, which is all about how why unsustainable fishing practices are the largest threat, not just to sharks but also to sea turtles, marine mammals, seabirds, and how sustainable management practices can help.
Yeah, I'm excited for that one to come out. And going along the lines of your book, so outside of being super awesome and cool, why do sharks matter?
Yes, so there's a reason why I didn't call the book I Like Sharks a Lot and It Makes Me Sad When They're Hurt. I focus on why is this important to people and people's lives. And it is important to people and people's lives to do this sort of work because when we're talking about the ocean and our coasts, those are food chains that provide billions of humans with food and with jobs, with what we call in policy world livelihoods and food security. And when we disrupt those food chains, it can disrupt the whole system in ways that are very difficult to comprehend. And it's very important if we want to protect these food chains and the ecosystem services that they provide to people and people's lives. We need to protect the top of the food chain because when we lose these predators, it can disrupt the entire system. And there are all sorts of cases of that all over the world. These food web disruptions are called trophic cascades. They're basically unpredictable ripple effects throughout the food chain. And there are it's really really difficult to predict exactly what's going to happen, but it's often quite bad. And we want if we want to benefit from these ecosystems, and we very much do, we need to protect the whole food chain, including the top.
And what are some of the various ecologies that sharks fit? Because a lot of people they think of great whites and tiger
Hmm.
sharks, but they don't think of maybe say like the Port Jackson shark or like cat
Yep.
shark, things like that.
Yeah, so there's more than 540 known species of shark, and there's a new species of shark, skate, ray, or chimera discovered somewhere in the world about every 2 weeks. So there's still plenty to do if any of your younger listeners are pondering a career in this space. Don't worry, we're not going to run out of work. Um, but some sharks, like the great white, like the tiger shark, like the bull shark that you've probably heard of, are apex predators, the top of the food chain. But other species are mesopredators, mid-level predators. They serve the same functional role as a grouper or something like that. And that's also very important. There are lots of things that eat sharks. There are larger sharks that eat sharks. There are big fish that eat sharks. There are birds that eat sharks. There are marine mammals that eat sharks. So these animals play all sorts of vital ecosystem roles, not just the most famous ones that people have probably heard of. And it's important to base our conservation and management decisions not on a popularity contest, but on what the science says is the most important. thing to do, and that means protecting not just the species that little kids have on their T-shirts because they're well known and beloved, but on everything.
There is a paper that I read a little bit ago that discussed conservation efforts and like you said, it's all of these classic, little kid t-shirt animals that get
Mhm.
almost all of the attention.
And
And
all the funding. Yep.
yes. And they get all of that. And for the most part, the marine animals lack that way more than the terrestrial stuff. Like your lions, tigers, bears, things like that get all of the funding comparatively. And then like things like sharks are like way, way down the line.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why groups like WWF, one of the biggest environmental nonprofits, has a panda as their icon. Everyone loves pandas. Pandas are cute. No one's afraid of pandas. And there's a reason why that is such a useful icon, such a useful logo. Everyone can get behind save the whales, but we don't just need to save the whales. We also need to save the algae. We need to save the sharks. We need to save the octopus. And this is where some of the public education work becomes really, really, really important. We need to not just talk to people about animals that they are already on board with saving, but persuade them and maybe get some other animals some fans.
Yeah. Going on the shark thing, what has made sharks so resilient throughout prehistory that they've been able to endure so many mass extinctions? And then why is now different?
Yeah. So the short answer is that these animals are extremely well adapted to a set of environmental circumstances that don't exist anymore because of humans. So sharks are a really, really ancient group of organisms. There were animals recognizable as sharks swimming in our oceans not only before there were dinosaurs on land, but before there were trees on land. They're hundreds of millions of years old, and they've survived every mass extinction event that's been around, including the famous one that killed the dinosaurs, but also several others. However, in my parents' lifetime, we've lost about half of them. And there's now about a little more than a third of all known species of sharks are assessed as threatened with extinction by the IUCN Red List. And the reason for that is humans. It's us. We are the number one threat to sharks by far, so much that there's not really a number two threat. And that threat is unsustainable fishing practices. That includes catching sharks on purpose, as well as catching sharks accidentally through what's called bycatch. That's when you're trying to catch a tuna, but you accidentally catch a sea turtle or a shark that was swimming near that tuna. It includes fisheries for the fins, which many advocates have heard of, but also fisheries for the meat, which many advocates have not heard of, even though that is a bigger threat that affects more species in the West than the shark finning trade does. So why are they especially vulnerable? It's because of their what's called their life history. They have a sharks and their relatives have a K-selected life history. Something like a salmon or a tuna, they spawn. They release these big clouds of sperm and egg into the water. One large individual can have hundreds of thousands of eggs. Sharks and their relatives don't do that. They have internal fertilization, and they have what's called a K-selected life history. That means they have relatively few babies, relatively infrequently, relatively late in life. A salmon can spawn when it's a couple years old. Something like a sandbar shark, my favorite species, they're 12, 13, 14 years old when they're first reproductively mature, at which point they have 4, 6, 8 babies every 2 or 3 years. So that's a lot compared to a human, but compared to a salmon, compared to a tuna, it's nothing. And it means that these animals are really, really, really vulnerable to overfishing and don't bounce back very quickly if overfished. There are sustainable fisheries for sharks, but a lot of fisheries for sharks, especially in the global south, are not especially well managed.
Hmm. And how is conservation status for sharks measured?
Yeah, so the one leading group that works on this issue is called the IUCN Red List. We actually just won a Guinness Book of World Records for the largest volunteer professional organization in the world. But it is a group of thousands of conservation science experts who use the best available scientific data and assess the conservation status of every species. not just sharks, everything. There's a fungus specialist group, there's a parasite specialist group. The shark specialist group just happens to be one of the ones that I work with, and there's this consistent, rigorously developed set of criteria. Every conservation status of every species is freely available online at iucnredlist.org. It's basically a peer-reviewed summary of the biology and ecology and conservation status of that species, and they're reassessed every 10 years. If anyone wants to learn a lot more about the IUCN Red List, you can actually do the training course to be an IUCN Red List assessor for free online at conservationtraining.org. That's an exercise I have my students do just to really hammer home this idea that this is a very rigorous um, very rigorous and quantitative and data driven process. It's not people's opinion. It's not based on vibes. It's set up so that any three trained experts who are working on something the same way or who are analyzing the same set of data would come to the same conclusion.
Which species have been most affected by anthropogenic causes?
Yeah, so there are the worst status in IUCN Red List parlance, the one that you definitely do not want to be, is critically endangered. Critically endangered means there's a reasonable chance that you will go extinct soon in a few years if nothing changes. And there are some species that are critically endangered, include great hammerhead sharks. There are some sharks in the South Pacific that are get a little bit less attention. There are also lots of endangered species of sharks, which is one level up, still in pretty bad shape, but not as bad. These are species that include short-fin mako sharks. Sandbar sharks are now endangered. Some thresher shark species are endangered. So it's a specific definition that has to do with exactly how much the population has declined over three generation lengths, and it gets mathy very quickly.
Hmm. And what have been some historical conservation efforts that have been implemented to save them, and which ones have worked and which ones have not worked?
Yeah, so a lot of these are so new that we don't really have a lot of evidence showing that they work or didn't work. Because the life history of these animals means even if all their threats are eliminated and they start bouncing back, it's going to take a really long time to do that. At one point, the rebuilding plan in the United States for a species called dusky sharks was estimated that it was going to take 350 years for them to fully rebound. That's since been reduced down. That's notably longer than there's been a United States of America. So the U.S. government is producing documents about fish, estimating that it'll take longer than there's been a United States government. There are some species that are starting to rebound in some locations. Uh, this is due to primarily sustainable fisheries management improvements, though there are some cases where it's because of a marine protected area or because of gear restrictions or because of things like that. So there are success stories that can be found all over the world, which is not to say that the threats are totally solved. A thing that I stress to my students is that these facts and figures, such as some species of sharks have had a 99.9% population decline since the 1970s, that's just devastating to hear. But all hope is not lost. We know how to fix this. We know what needs to be done to fix it. We know for many of these, we know that they work because we've tried them and measured the impacts. There's also a lot of what I would call well-intentioned nonsense that pollutes this discourse. That's if you see this on social media a lot. Perhaps my favorite example of this is these online petitions that people make through websites like change.org. There was one a few years ago that called on the state of Florida in the US to ban the practice of shark finning, and it got 150. This was in like 2023, this petition, and it got 150,000 people to sign the petition. Shark finning was banned in Florida in 1993, 30 years before the petition was made, and not one of those 150,000 people apparently knew that. So this cannot possibly do anything to help sharks because the threat it was focusing on was already dealt with. All it does is confuse people about what the threats are and how to usefully solve those. There's also some nonsense in the recreational scuba diving community. Most members of the scuba diving community are very respectful with wildlife. Going scuba diving in general can be very useful to ocean conservation in general. You're helping to make marine wildlife more valuable alive than dead, and that itself can be a very valuable thing to do. But there are people who ride sharks. There are people who hug sharks. There are people who grab sharks and flip them over to take a picture. Don't do that. That's not helping anything.
Yeah. And have anthropogenic causes been the culprit for extinction of any sharks historically?
There's some debate on that point. There are some species that have been that were around in sort of vaguely modern times, like since the Industrial Revolution, that's no one's seen in a century or more. There are also That's also true of a few fish species. Uh, there's some debate on whether or not they were sort of already on their way out, or if humans caused it. That was certainly before the advent of modern industrial scale fishing. So there a clear smoking gun example? I don't think so. But there are some species. One example, a name that I really like actually, is called the lost shark. And that was alive in not in my parents' lifetime, but in my grandparents' lifetime, and no one's really seen them since. There are also lots of cases of what we call extirpation, which is they used to be found in a particular place, but they're not anymore. So that's not extinction, but it's also bad. In a scientific paper that researchers who I used to work with published, that has what I think is one of the most poetic titles I've ever seen in a scientific journal article. It's called Ghosts of the Coast. It talked about sawfish, which are a shark-like ray, a relative of sharks, that are were so well known in some parts of their range that they're on currency. They're on money in some of these countries, even though the animal hasn't been seen there in 30 years. So we know that they used to be there, but they're not there anymore. Small tooth sawfish in the United States have one of the most dramatic extirpations and range reductions I've ever seen. They used to be found from about New York to Texas, so basically the whole eastern Gulf Coast, and now they are reliably found in a small part of South Florida. So are they, and that is that chainsaw on their face. It's hard to imagine a biological structure that is better suited to getting tangled in fishing gear.
Yeah, that's very, very unfortunate with those. One of the things that you talk about is that you're like a big advocate for is using social media and technology to better share conservation with the general public. And what are some of the strategies that can be implemented with social media and technology more broadly to get public awareness, focus on conservation and ultimately helping build back some of these ranges?
So I call myself a marine conservation biologist, and that is a different from sort of pure marine biology. Pure marine biology answers questions like where does the fish go? Whereas marine conservation biology is more applied and has questions like where does the fish go relative to its known threats and what can be done to ameliorate those threats in its migration path. So it's critically identifying these solutions. If we just publish them in scientific journal articles in journals that no one's ever heard of, that is not by itself going to save the world. So what we need to do is communicate this to stakeholders. We need to make sure that we need to get people to care about sharks, but even among people who care about sharks, it matters what they know. Because you get people who care about sharks who sign ban shark finning in Florida petitions and think I've done my part to help sharks this month. So social media is an incredibly powerful tool for this. And I am among the conservation science community. I am certainly not the first to advocate for going out and talking to stakeholders, but I was one of the first to use these emerging social media tools to do it, and it's been enormously successful. When properly utilized, social media tools make it easier than ever before in human history for experts to share their message with the masses. Unfortunately, many scientists do not use them correctly, resulting in sort of what we call shouting into the void, which is you are not reaching it doesn't matter how important your message is, it doesn't matter how passionate you are about it. It's not communicated in a way that your target audience will hear it and get the message. So I have not only worked on this as a practitioner, but I've also researched more effective ways to do this, and I've trained thousands of early career scientists all over the world how to do this. I actually now offer an open enrollment course in this, which means you don't have to attend one of my in-person workshops at a conference. People can sign up for this online class through the Center for Wildlife Studies. We're offering it in fall 2026 and probably again in spring 2027. And you can do this for university level credit or just to learn the skills.
And with that, one of the big concerns that I've and a lot of people have is the ever growing prominence of AI generated content
Hmm.
on these social media platforms, whether it be them just creating a whole new shark that doesn't exist, or them generating these fictitious depictions like over the top of shark attacks and things like that. How do you think AI is going to affect public perception of sharks, awareness, and ultimately like guiding people towards wanting to conserve them? Because a lot of this stuff seems to be pretty negative for them rather than positive depictions.
Yeah, so AI is bad for public understanding of the world in general because it can be a really powerful tool for simplifying some tasks that you already know how to do. But the problem is people who don't know how to do those tasks use these AI tools and it results in them not learning and therefore not knowing that something's not right. Because AI also hallucinates things. When ChatGPT first came out, I asked it to summarize my 10 most influential scientific research papers. And five of the papers, it actually did a really good job of citing and summarizing, and the other five absolutely did not exist. The titles of the papers that it generated sure sounded like something I would write, but I didn't. They were in journals I published in, but if you look at those page numbers, it's a paper about sea turtles or about tuna that someone else wrote. So the AI generated imagery and videos is also a very big problem for this because we need people to understand what is really happening. We need people to understand what the threats really are, what solutions are really out there, and how they really work. Other than these really over the top graphic imagery of sharks biting people that you mentioned, which obviously scare people, there are also lots of AI graphics all over social media that are about supposed solutions to save the ocean. And it's an AI graphic of a pristine ocean with dolphins playing, and it said we've solved the ocean plastic pollution crisis. And like, no, we didn't. Even when these things do have citations, they describe a really, really, really limited case study, and it certainly was not a real image. So it is a problem both in making people afraid, but also contributing to large scale misunderstanding of how do we fix it and is it fixed.
And it's not even just amateurs or citizen scientists or people like that are interested in it that are getting fooled. You know, researchers that if they're in like a slightly different topic and
Oh
they
yeah, all
don't
the
know,
time.
man, yeah, and they get fooled too. So this it affects everybody, not just people that don't have, say, a lot of knowledge about sharks or whatever these fictitious things are. Like if you don't know the anatomy of something and you're not able to like pinpoint that. Like I saw a video of, I think it was a goblin shark, but like it had six or seven gill slits on it. But if you're just a person that doesn't know about the anatomy of goblin sharks, you might have
Yeah,
thought that was a real video.
yeah, it can that can be a real problem for sure. And it's not even just scientists who are in experts in other fields. It's our especially people who are not especially digital media savvy. So the some members of the older generation of scientists, I see them sharing AI slop all the time and saying, "Wow, this is really great news that this is done." Like, no, that's not real. How do you not know that?
It's surprising. The issue is that it's only going to get worse and worse
Yep,
for spotting this.
yep.
Are there any ways to combat it? Would you say?
Really stress to my students that it's anything that seems too good to be true probably is. Checking for just media literacy is the answer, and encouraging people to be careful about their own personal use of AI. An analogy that I use that seems to land with my students is you can go to the gym and you can lift weights yourself or you can use a forklift to move the weights around, and either way the weights get moved, but you don't actually benefit from it if you're not doing it yourself. And the same is true of outsource. You should not outsource your reading. You should not outsource your writing. You should not outsource your thinking to these AI tools, and you should be very, very aware of how to spot incorrect things, be they AI or just text based.
Yes, and corroboration is probably the most important thing in my opinion. Like if you see something and it seems too good to be true, you look it up, and while media outlets may not be accurate, if you have a ton of them pulling up and then they have sources for their stuff that you can like follow the breadcrumbs, that
Yes,
that's how you can kind of depict, like say, okay, this probably is legitimate. But if it's like this wild new discovery that's being flaunted on Facebook and then there's no mention of it
yes.
on Google, then it's probably fake.
In the modern media landscape, it is extremely unlikely that the only news outlet to be covering a story that has exciting results is a media outlet you've never heard of. That's it's just probably not the case. With the way press releases and embargoes work, with the way that reprints work, uh, if there's only one media outlet covering a story and you've never heard of them, that is a real bad sign about the accuracy of that story.
Yeah. And going away from AI, what are some actionable steps that we, whether it be like on the governmental level, the societal level, or the personal level, can implement like now to preserve sharks?
Yeah, the single most effective thing that an individual can do to help sharks is don't eat unsustainable seafood. Again, that's going to be the subject of the whole subject of my second book. But I stress that doesn't mean we all need to give up all seafood and become vegan or else the ocean is doomed. There are people claiming that that is not supported by science. If you want to do that, you certainly can for any reason that you like. But the claim that we all need to give up eating fish or else the ocean is doomed is just not true. And in many cases where it's not a feasible, there's not a feasible alternative. So supporting well-managed, sustainable fisheries that have a minimal environmental impact is a great thing to do. If you don't know what that means, check out my book this fall. But also, a good first guide is the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch guide. And if something is on the green list for the Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch, or if it has the Marine Stewardship Council Bluefish checkmark on it, that's a good sign that a team of experts has evaluated it and said it's good. Other things that people can do to help the ocean are donate time or money to reputable nonprofits on social media, share information from relevant, reliable, accurate expert sources, um, submit formal public comments in support of or in opposition to certain government regulations. Critically, this means writing something like "I oppose Amendment 14A and support Amendment 16B instead," and not just writing "Save the sharks." You don't know how to do that, but if you follow reliable experts on social media or sign up for mailing lists, you will know how to do that.
Hmm. Moving away from that, what
Mhm.
are some other misunderstandings that people have with sharks more generally?
So the one of the biggest things, misunderstandings that people have about these animals is that they're really dangerous and that we should get rid of them to keep ourselves safe. Sharks do hurt people sometimes, but it's very, 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 very rare. In a typical year in the United States, more people are bitten by other people on the New York City subway system than are bitten by sharks in the whole world. More people die in a typical year from flower pots falling on their head when they walk down the street from apartments above them than are killed by sharks. More people in a typical year are killed when they fall off a cliff while trying to take a selfie of the scenery behind them than are killed by sharks. And some people are hurt by sharks, some people even die. And that's tragic. But when we're talking about policy solutions, you need to consider the relative risks and benefits of these things. And uh, the ecosystem services that sharks provide are enormously valuable, and we are better off with sharks than we are without them. On the other side of the pendulum, among the conservation community, there are people who do not believe that sustainable fisheries for sharks exist, and obviously the only solution is that we need to ban all fishing for sharks or ban all fishing for everything, and that's not only not true, but would result in tens of millions of humans starving to death. So that's a conservation solution that will result in tens of millions of humans starving to death is not a good conservation solution.
Are there other misunderstandings as far as what the actual threats are for sharks? compared to what people think are the threats for sharks.
Yeah, the number one threat that's just dominant is this unsustainable fishing practices. Among threatened species of sharks, 100% of them list unsustainable fishing practices in their top few threats. The only other thing that makes more than 10% is habitat loss. So things like climate change, really bad for the ocean. We should do something about that. Not that big of a deal for sharks. Plastic pollution, really bad for the ocean. We should do something about that, but not that big of a deal for sharks. So people who say like I'm doing my part for sharks, I'm using a metal straw instead of a plastic straw. Is that a good thing to do? Sure. Is that going to save the life of a single shark? Probably not.
Yeah. And yeah, especially when you think about like the resilience of sharks and what they've went through in the past, you can kind of see that some of these things have affected them, but they've still been, able to survive all of this different stuff. But at the same time, it's more of like a compounding effect where like that'll affect if you said like maybe 10% of the issues with them. But once you give the other 90%, it just makes it, you know, worse. But it's not like the sole or even the largest
Yes,
contributor to their decline.
absolutely. So plastic pollution is bad. We should get on that. But if we totally fix plastic pollution and don't fix overfishing and harmful fishing practices, we're going to lose many sharks. If we totally fix unsustainable fishing practices and we don't fix plastic pollution at all, sharks are going to be in great shape. We should fix both. They're both bad, they both impact lots of things, and they're both fixable. But the scale of the threat is just not even close.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate having you on, David. And we do have a question that we like asking at
All
the end,
right.
which is if you were to make any discovery in your research career, what would it be? But I feel like in your case, maybe it would more so be like if one thing that you were pushing got realized, like one conservation effort was set into effect and had its way, what would that be and why?
Yeah. So, an issue that I've been working on for a long time and have had some success with is just sort of recognizing that recreational fishing, fishing for fun, can have a significant conservation threat, a significant conservation impact, especially for species whose numbers are already way down because of other things. And during my PhD work involved getting the state of Florida to change their fishing laws, particularly for hammerheads for recreational anglers. It's now illegal to bring a hammerhead out of the water. If you catch a hammerhead, you have to cut the line with it still in the water. Um, so I'd like to see more consistent application of science in coastal conservation laws, especially with respect to recognizing that recreational angling can be a real problem.
And how big of an issue is it if you're cutting the line and it still has like the hook in its mouth?
That's a good question. And it's not great for a shark, obviously, to have a hook in its mouth and be trailing several feet of line behind it. But it's so much less bad than dragging that shark out of the water, wrestling it on sand or wood or concrete, and removing the hook. These big animals, in particular, they because their skeletons are made of cartilage, they can't support themselves out of the water, and they also can't breathe. On sand in particular, if it gets in the gills, it causes bleeding microaggressions that do not ever heal. So imagine being never able to take a full breath of air again the rest of your life, no matter how hard you exercise. So the goal is get it as close to you as possible and cut the line as close as possible. And also, if you're using the sorts of fishing hooks that are recommended by best practice guides, they'll rust out in a few weeks. So it won't be trailing this forever.
Well, I appreciate all of your wisdom and input on this. It's definitely a really important topic and yeah, you're definitely right that we can't just focus on like the fun sciencey stuff with sharks without also figuring out how to actually preserve them. Because we don't want them to just be a thing of the past and only have paleontology and historical biology to go off of with them. We want to still have them in our oceans.
Yep.
So I appreciate it. And if you've listened to the very end, you are definitely a shark nerd. So please like, comment, subscribe, and hit that notification bell to keep this channel going and support us with all of our shark endeavors.